Good morning. Snuneymuxw First Nation people welcome participants to Snuneymuxw territory. This year, due to the pandemic, this meeting is virtual, and I welcome all of you to this meeting wherever you are. The information that will be shared with you over the next couple of days convey the state of the economy. Importantly, thoughts will be shared with you about the importance of the emerging Indigenous economy. Support and partnerships to build an economy that is inclusive of Snuneymuxw people and works to better everyone's life is key to unlock our fullest potential to prosper and create a future for all of our children and grandchildren to walk together. Take care and have a great next couple of days.
Hello everyone, I'm Lisa Helps and I'm the Mayor of Victoria, and I'm here on the homelands of the Songhees and Esquimalt Nations. It's an honor to be the honorary community host of the Vancouver Island Economic Alliance Annual Summit. This is a very, very important time to come together as an island economy, to understand each other's challenges, to help each other on the long path to recovery. The next few days are filled with really important discussions, workshops, calls to action, and I hope that we can all learn from each other, grow with each other, and most importantly, strengthen our economy and make it more resilient as we find our way out of COVID-19. I wish us all the best for the next couple of days of workshops and deliberations. Thanks for having me.
Welcome everybody to the 2020 Vancouver Island Economic Summit. As I speak to you from the traditional territory of the Snuneymuxw First Nation, along with my good friend, Chief Mike Wise, I want to ensure that all of you will have a wonderful experience with this year's unique event, unlike any other. For those of us who've participated for years and have recognized the incredible value of the Economic Summit and the value to its participants and to our economy and our communities, these are strange times. I accept, and we all have to acknowledge that. But the driving force behind all of this, the summit itself, George Hansen, his team, and all of you who have chosen to participate, remind us all what a wonderful place Vancouver Island is, that we are a part of the world where we are addressing our past and the historical wrongs to our Indigenous people in a meaningful, respectful, and I believe increasingly successful way year after year as we see more and more economic opportunities, more and more opportunities to grow our cultural side of things, more and more opportunities for everyone to enjoy the incredible lifestyle that Vancouver Island offers. So I want to say thank you to all of you who chose to participate this year. Exchange your ideas, show us your enthusiasm, point us the way forward to ensure that we will come out of this difficult time better than we were before, more resilient, ready to face the future with confidence, working in partnerships up and down the island to ensure our mutual success from one end to the other. So welcome again and enjoy the summit.
Hi, my name's Rob Bai. I'm the General Manager of the Vancouver Island radio stations for the Jim Pattison Broadcast Group and our news portal, the Nanaimo News Now. Thanks for joining us for this fantastic session that's coming up, a keynote presentation. The Jim Pattison Broadcast Group, longtime supporters of VIEA and everything that VIEA does here so positively on Vancouver Island. We're glad that you're here with us, and hopefully while you're enjoying the content on the website and the platform, you make sure to check out our booth in the virtual summit platform and connect with us over the next couple of days. So let's get on with the program. Our keynote presentation, Dr. Justin Bull. Enjoy.
Hi, as we begin tonight, I want to recognize that we live and work on unceded Coast Salish territories, and we honor the history and strength of the Coast Salish peoples and their teachings. I'm Christy Rivet, co-founder of Scale Collaborative, a social enterprise dedicated to supporting social purpose organizations to have financial resilience and strength to scale the positive impact they are having. Scale also works at the systems level to create and grow the social enterprise, social procurement, and social finance ecosystem. I'm excited to introduce Dr. Justin Bull, who will share his insights on the COVID-19 crisis and what do we need to learn from crises about our economic systems and entrepreneurialism. Once we've heard from Dr. Bull, we will open a Q&A forum so the audience has time with Dr. Bull. So please feel free to type in your questions in the chat box, which is located below the middle of your screen, and I will do my best to get to as many questions as possible. Dr. Justin Bull. He is a lecturer at UBC's Sauder School of Business and leader of the Sustainability and Ethics Group. He teaches extensively on sustainability, innovation, and strategy, with a focus on graduate and executive learners. He has worked with big companies like IKEA, Lyft, and Rolling Stones to implement climate innovations. Dr. Bull serves as an advisor and board member to several technology startups and First Nations in Canada. We welcome and thank Dr. Bull for being here tonight. And so, audience, sit back and enjoy.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for having me, and thank you to the organizers and all of you for joining me here this evening. My name is Justin Bull. It's an absolute pleasure. I'm a lecturer at the Sauder School of Business with a focus on sustainability, entrepreneurship, and innovation, and it's a real honor to have an opportunity to talk about this topic of entrepreneurship and what we can learn from the COVID-19 crisis in terms of the future of entrepreneurship and what lessons we might be able to draw from the field of sustainability and climate change and changes in technology that allow us to really take advantage of this crisis in terms of reimagining what kind of businesses are going to thrive, reimagining the kind of roles we're going to play in a future economy. So that's what I want to run through with you this evening. So Justin Trudeau said this just a couple years ago at the World Economic Forum, and I know it felt like a more peaceful time, perhaps a little more normal, quote unquote. But he just said, look, the pace of change has never been this fast, yet it will never be so slow again. At the time, he was referring to the pace and change in business, and the pace and change in geopolitics, and the pace and change in technology. And along comes the COVID crisis and actually accelerates this. Look at the rate at which scientists are developing a vaccine for this novel coronavirus. It's incredible. We don't have a successful vaccine just yet, but we have several vaccines in phase 3 candidate trials. We've been able to make progress that is absolutely unprecedented when it comes to vaccine development. We have trials across the world running that have been aided and enhanced and amplified in their effectiveness by the use of technology and additional collaboration and cooperation between different countries and different companies. And call me an optimist, but I actually think we have a very good chance of developing a vaccine for the coronavirus, which will be an absolute breakthrough, a scientific and technological marvel, because we've never developed a vaccine for a coronavirus of this nature, and two, we've certainly never developed a vaccine in such a short period of time. And so that to me is a fantastic piece of evidence for the fact that change is happening, and it's happening very quickly. But there's another kind of change that's going on around us, and that seems to be happening in a way that is alarming, is unsettling, and feels almost like it's gathering speed. The fires in California and Oregon and Washington State, and all of the smoke that impacted the lower mainland and southern Vancouver Island as a result of those fires, those were unprecedented in scale and ferocity and impact. And while forests have always burned, one of the things that we understand is that climate change and drier summers and drier winters and hotter summers and less snow in the winter, the cumulative effect of these built up changes in our climatic systems are impacting forest fires in a way that is making them larger than they otherwise would be. And we're seeing that not just in fires, we're seeing that in storms, we're seeing that in extreme weather events, we're seeing that in growing seasons for various crops. We are essentially engaged in two sort of concurrent exponentials. The exponential of technology and now the exponential trend, worryingly, of a changing climate. And so the question is, what can COVID help us in terms of understanding these two trends? So we're going to walk through 5 key lessons in our talk this evening. The first is that everything is connected. The second, that is acting early, is very much worthwhile. The third is that as a society and as a sort of in our modern world in general, really needs to start working on getting its priorities straight. The fourth is that when you know that something is true and you deny it anyways, it tends to be quite expensive. And the fifth lesson that we intend to walk through today is this notion that we need to find out ways to not only grow the pie, but how to better split the pie as well. And that's where entrepreneurship really comes into play. So those of us who work in sustainability and are concerned with the topic have always been trying to communicate to folks that, look, everything is connected, that you should care about what's going halfway around the world. You should care about the fate of an animal. You should care about the fate of a low-lying nation state. You should care about the future of a species or an ecosystem. You should care about deforestation. You should care about melting sea ice, that it means something to you. And most folks had a hard time connecting with that because it was abstract. The consequences were hard to feel in your day-to-day lives. The consequences of these systemic changes in climate that we were witnessing were hard to sort of put a finger on. But nonetheless, sustainability practitioners kept trying to preach this mission. Everything is connected, they'd say. And COVID comes along and gives us the perfect example about how you treat a species, how you treat animals, how you have global air travel, how you have interconnected economies, interconnected societies that allow ideas to essentially move very quickly, allow negative and positive impacts to be able to move very quickly. Everybody now sort of understands how the fate of a pangolin or a bat and the way that animal is treated can actually indirectly maybe even shut down the entire global economy. And so I don't think from a sustainability perspective we are ever going to have to struggle ever again to help people understand that caring about things halfway around the world is worthwhile because it's all interconnected. And so we suddenly have this story that we can tell that we've never been able to use before. Because if you remember back into the early days of the lockdown and the COVID crisis, this idea of flattening the curve was the thing we heard more about than almost anything. The idea was that, look, if we minimize social distancing, if we maximize social distancing, we minimize physical contact, we're not going to overwhelm our hospital resources, right? We're not going to be in the yellow scenario where, because there's a huge leap in the number of cases, we overwhelm hospitals, and those who do get sick are unable to be treated effectively, which we saw, unfortunately, in other countries around the world. So let's prioritize social distancing, and let's not exceed the capacity of the system. And one of the things that happened early on in COVID is that we saw this notion of flattening the curve when we said, let's apply this elsewhere. Why can't we flatten the climate curve too? Why isn't the system capacity Earth's carrying capacity? And why isn't the yellow blob that you see on your screen here business as usual? Right, where we understand that if we keep growing the way we are, if we keep using more energy in the ways that we are, if we continue to ignore the environmental consequences of our economic behavior, we're going to overwhelm Earth's natural ability to absorb our impacts, to absorb our abuse. But if we prioritize sustainability, we can continue to meet people's needs, continue to have a thriving and growing economy, but we can do it within the capacity of the system on which we rely. And so that's the second big message that we know that we can carry forward when it comes to COVID-19 and what it teaches us about the future of a successful economy. The third message is one around getting our priorities straight. So what was happening is that sustainability, which is this notion of people, planet, and profit. Well, sustainability required profit first, and then if we had just enough profit, then we might start taking care of people. And if we were taking care of people and whatever was left over, we might do a good job at maybe taking care of the planet. But it was never central to what it was we were doing. Right? The profit model, the need to generate returns for shareholders, was this dominant idea. And it was the primary idea, and everything else seemed to come second or third. And again, sustainability advocates and practitioners were arguing for a more balanced approach. We were hoping for some three-legged stool where people, planet, and profit were considered simultaneously. But what COVID has taught us, and indeed has done us a great favor in terms of preparing for future shocks and preparing for future crises like climate, is that you ignore the planet at your peril. That our economic systems really are a subset of what society tolerates. And what society tolerates really is a subset of what our planet provides. And so if you degrade the Earth's carrying capacity, if you degrade sort of the ecosystem's ability to meet people's needs, to provide that kind of stability that we are so accustomed to, society is going to respond. And when society responds and governments respond, economies are reshaped, profit models, old ones are thrown out the window and new ones come to the fore. And so COVID has given us this opportunity to ask ourselves, do I got my priorities straight? Does my business, does this sector of the economy that I participate in, does a provincial economic strategy, has it really gotten those priorities straight? Because there's actually real opportunity in recognizing this hierarchy and how you can flip it on its head. Because look, this is a story. Consider this 6-step process of a scientist warning you about something, and then politicians and other folks denying that something's even going on. But eventually the reality of whatever it is becomes too hard to ignore. The solution is expensive, but the longer you wait, the more expensive it gets. And so eventually you act. Now, this 6-step process is really climate or COVID, right? COVID, we had scientists, we had doctors in China warning us about a novel pneumonia virus in December of 2019. And it took well over a month for a lockdown and real aggressive public health measures to come into play. We had folks in China warning us that we should be doing something more seriously about this. And again, every country, almost every country, some island states managed this a lot better than others, but a lot of folks pretended like this was just going to go away, or that lockdowns were somehow inappropriate, or travel restrictions were against our better judgment or our better nature. And now, in retrospect, and with the benefit of hindsight, we're saying, you know what, that was not useful. Because the reality of COVID became so difficult to ignore that we eventually did shut down, and it's cost us an absolute fortune. The impact on global GDP, the impact on lives, on livelihoods, on jobs, on businesses is profound. But we've had to do it because we recognize that when it came to a trade-off between people's lives and the functioning of our economy, we will prioritize lives. Now, it was 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit in Brazil where the United Nations really took their first bold step in identifying climate as an existential threat to humanity, recognizing that continued growth in CO2 emissions into the atmosphere without actually doing anything about that and putting a cap and then seeing those emissions decline was absolutely vital to maintain the kind of stable ecosystem that humanity relies on. 1992. And as you are more than aware, I suspect, there was a lot of denial that we could do anything, that it was worthwhile to do something, that solutions were even available, or that the science was even sound. But now we're in this space where reality has become so hard to ignore. And because we've waited so long to act, the solution is more expensive than it used to be, but the longer we wait, the more expensive the solution becomes. And so I think COVID-19 offers us a lesson that collectively we actually are capable of taking decisive and dramatic action. And we're also going to need something to pull us out of this economic rut. And there's nothing quite like reimagining and rebuilding and re-stimulating an entire economy with climate and addressing climate at its heart. There's nothing quite like that in terms of offering a vision and a roadmap forward. Just going back to the way things were doesn't seem to be a particularly ambitious economic plan. Decarbonizing the world by 50% between now and 2030, that's an ambitious plan. That's the kind of vision, that's the kind of opportunity that we need if we are to get ourselves back onto a more positive economic footing. Because we've gone through an accelerated systems level evolution. So typically, right, we operate tactically on a 1 to 2 year horizon. We operate strategically on a 3 to 5 year horizon. We have a vision that might be modeled out from 5 to 10 years. And then we recognize that systems level evolution occurs, 10 years or more into the future. So we have these like time cones. We shouldn't have timelines. We have time cones, recognizing that there's increasing certainty the further away from the present you are. And what COVID has done is essentially accelerated a systems level evolution. It has compressed this time cone. It has made the unthinkable realistic, if not implemented. Ideas that around working from home, or doing all of your commerce online, or the perhaps permanent move away from high levels of business travel, for example. All of those ideas are now suddenly being interrogated and revisited, and we've undergone a systems level evolution about how we connect, how we communicate, how we network, how we acquire customers, how we build relationships with them. And so instead of thinking that, I want to go back to the old system, and when that vaccine comes, isn't everything going back to normal? A much more constructive way to look at it is say, what is the systems level evolution that I've experienced, that my industry or my business has experienced, and what features are going to remain? And then start asking myself, are my strategies and tactics aligned with that? So as we talk about a post-COVID world and the recovery from COVID, you're all familiar with these various scenarios. A V-shaped recovery is what everyone was hoping for. We just got to lock down for a little while, and then we open everyone back up, and the economy is going to bounce back to normal. Well, that didn't seem to happen. So now it looks like we're in the midst of a U-shaped recovery, where we've seen significant drop in productivity in most sectors of the economy, and it's going to be sort of like a depressed growth, depressed activity for quite some time until it eventually returns. Or maybe we're in for like a W, where things are open and closed and open and closed, and we get kind of like a dead cat bounce. We're like, hey, the economy's doing great. Oh, wait, no, it's not. Second wave is coming. Shut it down again. Or maybe we're in for an L, right, where we just never return to previous levels of growth, previous levels of prosperity. Now, these scenarios will probably play out in different ways for different people, for different industries, for different careers, for different businesses. But the one that seems to have really actually taken hold is a K-shaped recovery, where there's a recovery for some people that follows a quick bounce back after sort of that immediate, say, decline in equity prices and stock market prices, and boom, those all bounced back. And most people, they figured out how to, bring their work back online. They found a new way to reach their customers. They found ways to pay their bills, but their business didn't face this kind of like existential threat. Their careers did not, right? And so for high wage earners, employment is still close to 99% of what it was before the pandemic. And the people who are taking this on the chin are the low-wage earners, people in the hospitality sector, in the service sector, in the retail sector, in the restaurant sector. Folks making, lower end of the wage spectrum, $15 an hour, $20 an hour. Those jobs are gone. And we don't know when they're coming back, or if they're coming back. And if they do, whether the same number of jobs come back. So they're experiencing a K-shaped recovery, where people who are already living paycheck to paycheck are facing the most economic distress. Indeed, this disconnect between stock market performance and the well-being of hourly wage workers, people who live paycheck to paycheck, is so perfectly exemplified by Amazon and Jeff Bezos, his net worth has increased enormously during this crisis, because unlike previous economic crises like the dot-com bubble of 2000 or the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, where job growth and stock market performance was actually quite tightly linked, here we've seen almost this massive separation. And Bezos alone has added so much to his net worth that he could have given every employee he has $876,000 and still maintained his pre-pandemic net worth. Now, this is just a thought experiment. This is not liquid cash. You can't just kind of like hand it out. I understand that. But it just gives you a sense, like a perspective on what it is we're going through here and the challenges we're facing. And indeed, if you look at just the last couple of years, even prior to the pandemic and now during the pandemic, right, whether it was the unrest and the protests in Hong Kong, the unrest and the protests in Belarus, the confronting colonial legacies across Canada, and the question of statues and naming and acknowledging our history, the massive protests associated with Black Lives Matter in the United States, and then protests on the other end of the spectrum against quarantine orders or lockdown orders or mandatory face mask policies. It just feels like there's a real sense of discontent with the status quo in a lot of places, and for a lot of different reasons. But I think at the heart of all of that is this idea that we just have not gotten the splitting of the pie right. So Ray Dalio is a very famous hedge fund manager, multi-billionaire, someone who wouldn't have to say a thing and could survive any kind of economic or planetary crisis, has the resources to do that. But he recognizes that, look, most capitalists don't know how to divide the pie well, and socialists don't know how to grow it well. But we're at this juncture where either A, people of different views are going to come together and try and engineer solutions to these problems, or B, we're going to have massive social unrest. And the challenge for entrepreneurs and the challenge for businesses in general is to say all this unrest, all of these complaints about the system, I don't have time for this, or I think it's unfair, or it's not something I want to get involved in, it's not my responsibility. But if we don't find a way to lean into these issues, if we don't find a way to address a sustainability crisis, an income inequality crisis, if we don't find a way to address Canada's colonial history or issues of systemic racism, if we try and shove those aside and think that they're outside of our domain, outside of our sense of purpose, we're not going to be working on figuring out how to grow and split the pie. And we're just going to be contributing further to sort of the inequities and the tensions and the fragility of the system that we rely on. So how do we do this? Right? How do we go through this? What's the role of an entrepreneur and an innovator and a thinker and all of this? I think the first thing is that if you want to grow that pie and split it, think about the trends that COVID has amplified. What pre-existing sort of technological, social, political, economic, geopolitical trends existed, and how have they been amplified? And do I want to ignore them, or do I want to lean into them? Because leaning into them is going to give you insight and opportunity and a competitive advantage in terms of reimagining what your business might be, what your career might be. So the first really obvious one is that, look, climate was a pre-existing priority, a pre-existing concern. It has not gone away. COVID has resulted in a temporary reduction in emissions, a very expensive temporary reduction in emissions. But they're not going away. And if you look at everything coming out of Victoria, everything coming out of Ottawa, and from countries around the world, when they're talking about how do we restart our economies, the word green is at the center of all of that. And what they mean by that is economic stimulus aligned with not only stimulating the economy, but addressing the climate crisis, that reimagining our built environments, reimagining our transportation systems, reimagining our energy systems, reimagining our manufacturing and packaging systems, all of these things are economic opportunities. And all of these things are opportunities to address the sustainability crisis. So the amount of stimulus dollars that are going to be flowing into projects where climate is a prerequisite, where climate is a must-have, is going to be enormous. And so that's a great place to play. Just ask yourself, am I on the right side of that trend? Have I internalized that thinking? Am I ready to participate in that wave of growth and innovation that's coming my way? Another trend is that the notion of work is just not not going back to what it used to be. Right? I'm not saying that people are never going back to offices. I think obviously all of us are frustrated by the lack of meetings, frustrated by the lack of face-to-face contact with people, frustrated by the lack of human connection. But I also believe that a lot of us have learned that, there's a pretty big benefit from flexibility. There's a pretty big benefit from not having to commute every single day, 9 to 5 days a week. That if I work from home every morning or a few mornings a week, if I only go into the office a few times a month, I can benefit from that human connection, but I can also benefit from this flexibility that working from home provides. And this has impacts on cities. This suddenly makes suburban communities, rural communities, even remote communities much more viable places for people to earn income in new ways, in different ways, to be able to have an office job, a tech job, an accounting job, a legal job, a finance job, a professional services job, but to live in a community that isn't necessarily used to having those kinds of positions. Right? So there's really interesting ideas, and already we've seen across Canada this big surge of people asking, do I really need to live in Vancouver? Comac's looking real nice right now. Cowichan Valley, I tell you, prices are a lot better than downtown Vancouver. A lot more space, a lot nicer air, a lot nicer place to raise my kids. Consumers' expectations have fundamentally changed. I had a birthday party recently, and they brought out the cake, and we were trying to have a socially distant birthday party. So someone who is in my bubble brings out the cake, and we were going to cut it up and serve it out to everybody afterwards. And what was bonkers was this idea that we used to blow on candles. Think about that. Think about how weird is that to think about someone would just actively try and evacuate the contents of their lungs on something that everyone was about to eat. So the trick is you wave your hand over the candles, like a whoosh, blow it out. Consumers and what they're going to tolerate is fundamentally going to change. It's never going to go back. I love the fact that I can order beer from a local brewery and they bring it to my front door a couple hours later, that I don't have to go to a liquor store to buy that. I love the fact that all of the small businesses that I like to support are suddenly figuring out online shopping. There's enormous conveniences that this low-touch economy have created: curbside pickup, contactless payments, prepayments, subscription models, small businesses who used to make it very difficult to connect with them now having to be online, being forced into the 21st century. This low-touch economy is not going away because it has advantages that will remain beyond COVID, that people, I think, are going to have permanently changed their psychology. There's going to be a permanent shift in people's psychology around hygiene and safety. And we'll never really want to blow on a birthday cake again. And we'll probably want to continue to benefit from all of these examples of a low-touch economy that we're surrounded with now. And I think one final point that I want to share is that if stimulus funding is going to flow to any project that's sort of climate focused or climate resilience, climate adaptation focused, I think there's another big test that our sort of economic growth and government supportive growth is going to have to pass. And it's going to be, does that project contribute to economic reconciliation? Does that project contribute or involve or benefit Canada's Indigenous peoples. Because Vancouver Island and British Columbia in particular, there is so much opportunity to partner with First Nations, to figure out how addressing that historical relationship and the historical inequities there actually offers a path forward. New economic opportunity, new business models, new joint ventures, higher levels of inclusion, higher levels of employment, higher levels of investment and involvement in the mainstream economy, bringing Indigenous values and worldviews into the mainstream economy and ensuring that the mainstream economy is working for Indigenous communities. And having meaningful partnerships is absolutely vital. Because if we take a step back and ask ourselves, like, where is the world right now and what is going on? We can reflect on this notion of original sin, right? In Christianity, it's that idea that ever since Adam and Eve decided to eat the forbidden fruit of knowledge, humans have had original sin, and different denominations of Christianity interpret this story differently, but I think there's something valuable in terms of trying to understand what's going on in our modern world, because we see so much struggle with this concept. Right? Fridays for Future and the climate strike. This is essentially our modern economy struggling to deal with the fact that we built all of this prosperity and technology and innovation. We built it all using carbon dioxide and fossil fuels. And now the bill is coming due. The Black Lives Matter movement in the United States is in part an acknowledgement or in part an expression of the fact that the wealth and prosperity of that country was built on slavery, built on entrenched, institutionalized inequality between races. The Occupy Wall Street movement of maybe a little longer ago, 99% versus the 1%, but nonetheless was a recognition that our modern hyper-capitalistic, hyper-globalized world benefited a small number of people a lot more than the average person. The Idle No More movement and the Shut Down Canada No movement of just a few months ago was rooted in the idea that, look, while Canada became prosperous and wealthy, we left behind the original inhabitants of this continent. And the Me Too movement that recognized that there was so much entrenched discrimination and harassment and inequality in our professional world between men and women. All of these are manifestations of us not just staring an injustice in the face and acknowledging that we're still living with that sin, and as opposed to trying to minimize it or diminish it or try and argue that it doesn't actually exist, we have an opportunity to lean in. And I think there's more entrepreneurial growth, more entrepreneurial ideas, more innovation to come from leaning into these challenges than on anything else. The easy stuff has been done, and the hard problems are left for us to solve. And businesses that figure out how to thrive while solving those problems, while internalizing those problems and having a purpose in solving some of those problems, are going to do very well. And so we can think of COVID as a green swan. We've heard of black swans, these creatures that come out of nowhere, some things that we never even imagined could exist, and they shock us, and they result in a destruction of value and a destruction of economic stability. But green swans, of which I hope COVID is, are these sort of calamitous events, these shocks to our system that actually force us to be more resilient, force us to be more regenerative, force us to be more sustainable in the social and economic systems that we advance and that we grow. So thank you very much for the time this evening. I look forward to answering your questions. And I really look forward to having you share some ideas around how you might take this big picture of what's going on in the world in 2020 and figure out how you can apply it to your career, to your business, and to your region. So thank you again.
Thanks, Dr. Bull. That was an excellent presentation. I'm really, we'll dive in a bit with the questions from the audience. So the first question that we've got is around, what do you think the impacts of all these trends you've talked about today might have on a resource-based economy?
That's an excellent question. I think that's one of the biggest concerns, certainly on Vancouver Island and across Canada. Historically, we have been a resource-based economy, and particularly a resource-based economy that thinks of ourselves as commodity exporters more than anything else. And so I think there are a few dynamics at play. One, if we're going to be producing resources, we better be producing them at the highest possible standard. And I think that the world is increasingly going to be willing to pay a green premium for products. And I think in the longer run, we're actually going to see is a lot of global players who are actually going to be concerned about embodied impacts inside products. And so the environmental footprint of a product is going to be something that becomes like what we would call a non-tariff trade barrier. And if that comes about, we better be thinking about developing the systems, building the capacity to measure and manage for those kinds of things in order to access those different kinds of markets. So that's if we continue to just play in the commodity space. But what I think we really need to be continuing to put our mind towards is figuring out how we move up the value chain, how we take a resource-based economy and start building a value-added process, a value-added manufacturing sector on top of that resource-based economy, so that we can be leveraging so many of the trends that we see that COVID is accelerating, so that we can be sort of expanding the amount of margin that we capture, as opposed to just exporting a commodity where we make a certain margin and allow other countries to make those kinds of margins. And so obviously in Alberta, the conversation is all about diversity and diversification. In British Columbia, particularly on the coast, I know there is significant anxiety, and rightfully earned anxiety, about what happens when we move entirely towards second growth logging. Like, it's not a question of when, it's not a question of if the old growth logging industry comes to a halt, the question of when, and what's it going to take to retool some of our mills and some of our manufacturing capacity here to actually participate, or perhaps develop entirely new forms of value addition. So at the end of the day, the resource economy is going to be exposed to a lot of these trends, whether from a commodity side or a value-added side. But the nice thing about the resource economy is that in the short term, it doesn't necessarily, obviously, it's easy enough to practice social distancing in a lot of manufacturing facilities or out in the field and whatever it might be. And secondly, the countries that we rely on, and what we should continue to do, is trying to expand our relationships with countries that are handling COVID well, because those are the countries that are going to be regrowing their economy. So, for example, obviously at the top of that list is China. And the fact that they were the origin of the outbreak, that then managed to contain that outbreak, and now have resumed economic growth and have excellent systems in place for identifying and controlling any additional outbreaks, suggests to me that their economy is going to do quite well in the years ahead, versus perhaps some of our other more traditional trading partners who seem to be struggling, to put it generously, with managing this pandemic. So that would be my view on that question.
So we have one here around the individual business owner.
Mm-hmm.
What can the individual business owner do today to really start to think about how they have economic growth within that curve,
Mm-hmm.
right? And how they are part of the solution. If we think about that planet, people to profit solution, is there things that they can do today to help support that? Or does that have to come from really that systems level and then shared out?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a lot harder for small and medium enterprises, sole proprietorships, or small businesses to engage in sustainability. If you look at the companies who are very progressive at managing and in implementing sustainability programs, they tend to be giant companies with a lot of capacity and a lot of ability to implement on those kinds of things. And so if you're a sole enterprise, it can be a little trickier. That doesn't mean there aren't actions you can take. It's just that the impact of those actions may be smaller, or your business may not have the profit margin necessary to actually take those. So I honestly don't think that solving our planetary crises and responding to shocks, I don't think that burdens, small businesses have enough burdens as it is. It doesn't seem fair to me that we place that burden on them. However, and I think there's an important caveat, where one, there's a lot of capacity, there's a lot of knowledge and consultants and platforms and software, all sorts of things that are emerging out there to support SMEs who are concerned with sustainability, to make it easier for them to manage sustainability initiatives internally because it's aligned with their values or aligned with the demands of their customers or their employees. And secondly, I think that what the sole proprietor can do is really embrace this idea that yes, sustainability may have a cost, but it's also a way to gain customer loyalty. It's a way to gain access to new markets. It's a way to develop new products or new business lines. And a lot of that comes with sort of reframing in your own mind what you think sustainability is. And so to many, I think we're stuck in a very outdated understanding of sustainability, which is the cost center for the rich and the privileged, or something that's imposed on me by government. And I think what sustainability really is an opportunity to evaluate how you can be creating, additional kinds of value for the community that you're a part of, for your customers, for your employees, and that in the long run, you will be rewarded with additional loyalty, preferential access to capital, and all sorts of lovely things like that. So I think SMEs should not bear the burden here, but there's also a lot more folks who are out there trying to support those who do wish to perform a little better in these areas.
So this question builds from there. It's how, or do you see social enterprises or B Corps playing a role in the revisioning of the economy?
Sure. So I think that's a really interesting question. There's one scenario where the B Corps and the social enterprise is suddenly embraced by stimulus programs, embraced by customers and consumers with a renewed sense of enlightenment, and they only want to support organizations that have a mission. And the B Corps experiences a renaissance, or not even a renaissance. It experiences some kind of ascension, because a renaissance would suggest they had an ascension in the past, which they probably really haven't. So maybe the B Corps is waiting in the wings to play a significant and stronger role. There's another possibility here, which is that the B Corps is this at the bleeding edge of what the purpose and responsibility of a corporation can really be. The B Corps is validating this idea that you can, in fact, be environmentally and socially responsible while generating financial returns. And the idea that those things are incompatible is now being invalidated at scale by thousands of organizations around the world. And maybe if we are so effective at invalidating that flawed hypothesis, that mainstream corporations will start acting more like B Corp, in which case in a post-COVID world, or in response to shocks like this, B Corps find themselves in more competitive places as the traditional corporate sector starts to behave with increasing responsibility. So I couldn't tell you which one of those things is going to happen, or what combination of those two things might happen, but both of them certainly seem in the cards.
So one of the questions from the audience is that they worry that we as human beings, we just don't have a strong track record for working together. Some feel that we should not lead the way because others will simply take advantage of us, because being responsible is not a competitive advantage in a global economy. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the questioners identified a couple interesting things, like the free rider problem, right? And this is a classic problem in economics, where it's like, well, if I'm more responsible, someone else may be less responsible, and therefore I am punished for my responsibility. There's no real reward to this, and then I suppose the second sort of pillar to their thesis here is that in a globalized economy, being responsible is now somehow a unnecessary, or something that you should not be doing, right? Because it's going to disadvantage you economically. But what I would be looking for is early signs of how other major economies in the world are starting to prioritize, at least identify and articulate plans around responsibility. And the big one, or I guess two huge signals, have occurred in this space in the last let's say 6 weeks, where one, China committing to be carbon neutral by 2060, which suggests that as quickly as China has gone in about 40 years from being one of the more poor economies in the world to essentially the world's largest driver of economic growth, quickly, becoming the number 2 economy and looking to be on path to be number 1 sometime in due order, perhaps by 2030, as soon as 2030. And so economy of that size, 1.4 billion people, saying sustainability and responsibility matters to us, certainly around this one issue, suggests to me that actually maybe you would want to start figuring out how to be more responsible so that you could sell to them, so that you suddenly don't find yourself frozen out of economies that start to care. Because the other big announcement was that just yesterday in Japan, the newly elected prime minister came out and said that their country is going to undergo a major reorganization. By 2050, they are intending to be carbon neutral. Or we could have an even tighter timeline by 2030, the Europeans saying we are going to aggressively manage and reduce our carbon emissions by 2030, looking at a 50% reduction. So I appreciate the point that the free rider problem is huge, but the question I'm asking is who are going to be the free riders? And increasingly, those free riders will be ostracized. And the last thing I would want to be is be the last one to move. Because one thing that we understand about Canada, and I love Canada, I'm from Canada, I'm a third generation British Columbian, and is that we don't have we do tend to have a mindset to move a little later than everybody else. Our firms are lower in productivity growth. Our firms are slower in embracing technology adoption curves. And the last thing I would want to see is our firms being slower to embrace this mindset shift that has happened in the last decade and will be amplified and accelerated by COVID, that it is time to stop thinking of responsibility as a cost center and start thinking about it as an opportunity to grow. And so at the end of the day, I suppose I don't accept the premise of the question.
And what role do you see local governments playing in a shift to a climate-friendly economy?
Yeah. I mean, again, it seems unfair it's kind of like putting SMEs in position for being responsible for encouraging sustainability. You know, if you have a limited mandate, limited governing capacity, why should it be on you as opposed to a province or a federal government that has a lot of policy levers and tools to pull on? And so local governments can certainly play a role. I think, from my part, in the context of British Columbia, the role of local governments maybe comes in solving not necessarily climate problems, but other sort of sustainability problems, because we have to start seeing the connection between all of these different kinds of problems. And I certainly think that to my concept of original sin and what is it that we should really be working on or thinking about in certain sectors of the economy is the relationship with First Nations. So if I was a local government, I'd be like, okay, what's our procurement target for buying from local First Nations? Is it going to be 2% of spend from local First Nations in the next 12 months, and then 4% 24 months from now, and then 10% within the next 5 years, and with a goal of fostering joint ventures and limited partnerships between non-Indigenous and Indigenous industry? Am I going to recognize that the place that I have leverage, the place I can play, is where I have spend? Now, local governments can do other things, plastic bans, policies supporting like more intelligent municipal waste collection. They can try and participate in the circular economy, which suggests that they're encouraging changes in packaging and changes in how their smaller businesses function, et cetera, et cetera. But the big issue of climate, at the end of the day, I think needs to be managed federally. We are seeing lots of places, the United States, climate is seeing such profound failure at the federal level that municipalities are the driver. But those are also municipalities with many millions of residents. Some of them are more residents than the entire province of British Columbia. So their leverage is a little different than like a town of 100,000 people or a town of 10,000 people. I think that we need to do a materiality assessment. Where do you have a material footprint, and where can you have a material influence over the outcome, and not necessarily try and solve every sustainability problem.
I will say too, on Vancouver Island, our municipalities are really, many of them are really starting to look at their procurement and really at least looking at especially that green, that Indigenous, and that social procurement piece. Sure. As to how they utilize their spend to really for the community well-being.
Excellent.
And those are dollars that they don't have to, they're already spending. So
exactly.
Those are good points to be able to shift how we spend what we're spending already.
Yeah.
What about small and medium enterprises? Should they be embracing the SDGs as a strategic pillar in their corporate plans?
Oh boy. I mean, that's a great question. No. They're just so small. Like, even understanding the SDGs like, you can embrace them at a high level, and then you have dozens of sub indicators and then hundreds of criteria associated with those indicators. And I'm just like, I don't think the capacity is there yet to support them. Now, I'm seeing a lot of consultants, and you could start seeing like the big four accounting firms starting to build up their capacity to measure and monitor reporting against SDG requirements. But it just seems like a real burden. Like, the last thing in the midst of a crisis like this, that small businesses need is additional sort of regulatory burden or reporting burdens, or more information gathering and burdens that are going to be really challenging. Now, if some small business, like, please don't get me wrong, if someone has the wherewithal and the inclination and the capacity to do it, that seems like a wonderful outcome. But I'm more inclined to say, figure out how is our province embracing the SDGs, or how are large industry groups embracing the SDGs, as opposed to trying to put that burden on SMEs. Instead, if I had one message to SMEs, and COVID has certainly proven this to be true, is that identify where you are on the technology adoption curve for your industry and do everything you can as if your house were on fire to move up it. If you aren't figuring out how e-commerce works for you, if you aren't figuring out how working from home works for you, or if you aren't figuring out how to eliminate as much of your material footprint as possible and virtualize every process as you can possible, if you aren't figuring about how the fourth industrial revolution that we're in the midst of, and leveraging artificial intelligence and the Internet of Things and 5G technology, all of these things that are coming at us like a freight train, if you aren't figuring that out, that's where my attention would be, because I think sustainability problems are going to be solved elsewhere. And then this focus on technology has an indirect benefit, which is that for the most part, it tends to actually reduce your footprint. There might be some spend up front, but you actually are starting to what we call dematerialize the footprint of your firm, right? You are creating the same value that you used to do, but the overall impact can be lessened by embracing technology. So that would be my advice to them.
And you see that as potentially a way to combat Amazon. That's sort of what I see, right? Because so many companies would rather shop local.
So many people would rather shop local, and the only thing stopping them is a question of convenience.
Yeah.
So if you're not making it as easy and as seamless, and so there's people who are doing it. Shopify is doing like white labeled shipping in partnership with companies like Landmark Logistics to make it really easy for even small businesses to have a fluid and easy return process. And yeah, you got to eat a lot of margin, but guess what? You also don't have to operate a storefront. So figure it out.
So this might be our last question, but I'm going to try to, we'll see. In terms of like from the consumer sort of side and that place, how do you deal with the greenwashing, where the worry is that the public's really going to get sucked into this marketing ploy, I'm all green, I'm all climate friendly, but it's really going to further delay and damage our planet and our people more?
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent question. And I think it's absolutely a risk. But as I say to when I'm talking about this, I always say, look, if you are sustainable, if you actually take responsibility seriously, you can command a better price because you have more loyal customers. You can do a more effective job at recruiting and retaining employees because people want to work for companies they believe are sustainable. You have preferential access to capital because you've better identified and managed your risk. You have lower insurance premiums because you've done a better job of actually figuring out what your impacts are. You have the opportunity to identify new markets and products that you could go be playing in. So the question I have for folks who are greenwashing is, why are you wasting your time? Why not actually unlock the value that sustainability is offering, as opposed to just using it as an excuse for inaction? It just seems like a massive wasted opportunity to me.
Sounds great. So I think we have a time for a very quick answer, and then that'll be the last question.
Sure.
And so in terms of financing and how we grow our economy, how does the notion of social impact investing factor in and support this growth?
Yeah, I mean, I think social impact investing has, there's a lot of people looking for returns that are aligned with their values. Two, we've seen enormous growth in the social impact investing space. Three, obviously the world is flush with capital right now, seeking interesting economic opportunities. And so I think there's going to be increased attention on social impact investing. But my answer will be quite similar to my answer about the B Corp, which is that I also see mainstream investing becoming increasingly concerned with ESG criteria, environmental, social, and governance criteria. And so will social impact investing continue to rise, or will the mainstream investing world start seeing opportunity and caring about impact because they see that it actually unlocks more stable returns and creates more economic opportunity? So in one way, one of the things that we in sustainability like to say quite often is that success is defined by putting yourself out of a job. And so whether it's the B Corp or whether it's social impact investing, or whether it's needing to convince people that sustainability is an opportunity, not a threat, if we're effective, no one will need to listen to us in the future. And certainly that's what I'm striving to do.
Thank you, Dr. Bull. I'd like to just take a moment to really thank the Jim Pattison Broadcast Group for sponsoring this session, to thank all the audience for joining us tonight. And Dr. Bull, you'll be receiving a gift from St. Jean's Cannery and Smokehouse as well. So thank you all for being part of today's conversation and for the enlightening keynote.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
We will see you all at the VIEA Summit for the rest of the days.